Congressman Scalise is joining us. Congressman, first of all, let's talk about, we're getting close to the height of hurricane season, and the FEMA 2.0 rating has forced hundreds of thousands of people across the country to drop their flood insurance. And according to the Insurance Institute, it looks like it could go as high as $1 million if the price keeps going up.
Yeah, Eric, FEMA's risk rating 2.0 is devastating to a lot of coastal areas. Clearly in South Louisiana, we're seeing the problem, but all across the country, we predicted this would happen if they went forward with it. That's why we had a bipartisan group of members of Congress who asked FEMA to stave off doing this, to not implement risk rating 2.0 because they couldn't even explain it. It doesn't make sense. And ultimately it was going to lead to lots of people leaving the program. And now we're seeing that because the rates are not only so high that they're forcing people out of their own homes, but FEMA can't justify and won't justify what was the methodology behind it.
But what is the fix? Because, I mean, they clearly were bleeding money.
Yeah, and the problem there is that in general, when you have big events, hurricanes here or other flooding events in other parts of the country, the federal government's always come in. And the federal government helps people like we saw after Katrina with programs like the Road Home program to help people get back in their homes, but they help people whether they had flood insurance or not. And so you would want more people paying into a system like NFIP as opposed to people that have no flood insurance, still got the same amount of help from the U.S. taxpayer. So having a flood insurance program that works, I'd like to see a private marketplace for flood. It just doesn't exist right now.
Do you think that would be viable?
One day I think it could be, and I think one of the models we ought to look at is the reinsurance model, in having the National Flood Insurance Program work as a reinsurance market so that private carriers would come in and write policies knowing that if there was a big catastrophic event, there's ultimately going to be a backstop. But
okay,
regardless of that, we need some reforms.
Insurance companies, I mean, they're there to make money, clearly.
Yeah.
And you know, we see insurance companies pulling out of Louisiana all the time.
Yeah, and in Louisiana, we're seeing it in a few ways. One, with flood insurance through risk rating 2.0, that becomes unaffordable. But you're also seeing some private companies leave just the general homeowners marketplace, which is also bad because in Louisiana, there's a public entity, and that is this public resort option, which is getting a lot more people moved into it. And that's not something you want to see either. So if we don't have a private marketplace for flood, which we don't, you need to make NFIP work. And it's not working right now under risk rating 2.0. I would hope that they would throw that out, go back to work with Congress, and ultimately we have a bipartisan group of members of Congress who want to work to make this program get reformed, get working better. But right now, FEMA is not working with us. FEMA won't even come to a public hearing to explain what risk rating 2.0 is. If that's the case, if they can't explain it, then they ought to put it on hold because it's not ready for prime time.
And if we can switch gears, we're getting ready for the November elections. They're only a couple of months away, a few months away. Mitch McConnell said yesterday that he does not see a clear path for Republicans to retake the Senate. He's worried that, and the Republican Party has been concerned about some of the candidates that have been backed by former President Trump who are not doing well in the polling.
You know, we've always said that the road to winning the Senate back is a lot harder than winning the House back. Of course, I've been very focused on winning the House and, firing Nancy Pelosi, we need to flip 4 seats in the House. There's a lot more opportunities we have to win seats all across the country on the Republican side.
But the landscape has changed a bit. President Biden's got a lot of things passed that were bipartisan in some instances. Gas prices are down, and the Roe v. Wade. I mean, we saw what happened. The cutting of Roe v. Wade. We saw what happened in Kansas, a very Republican state, and they overwhelmingly supported a woman's right to choose.
Well, but what you are also seeing is a majority of Americans support the Dobbs decision, and that was the heart of the issue at the Supreme Court, the Mississippi law that says after 14 weeks you can't get an abortion.
But Chief Justice Roberts did not want to
right. Roberts supported Dobbs, but Roberts didn't overturn Roe. And there you have the debate. I mean, look, this is going to ultimately be fought out mostly in the states. Louisiana's got its own law that's on the books. But every state's having this debate, and it's definitely fired their base up, but it's also fired up up a lot of pro-life people who finally got this victory, but know that the battle is not over. And so I think you're going to see, number one, we're still over 2 months away from the election. I think you're going to see ebbs and flows in where voters go, but ultimately voters don't like inflation. They don't like high gas prices. The bill Biden just signed a few days ago, $730 billion in new taxes and more than doubling the size of the IRS. 87,000 more IRS agents to go after low and middle income families. That's not popular
Let's
either.
go back to Roe v. Wade, because the repercussions of that are being felt by a lot of women who have no choice but to terminate a pregnancy, and the laws in some cases are so badly written. I mean, we just saw a case here in Louisiana, up in Baton Rouge, where a woman was carrying a child who had a problem with the child's skull and would not be able to carry it to full term, but the hospital was afraid to perform an abortion.
Well, first of all, life of the mother is still an exception in Louisiana law.
Well, her life
every
wasn't
state's got a
threatened,
different every state's got a different set of exceptions. In New York, the baby can be aborted after it's born alive outside the womb, which, by the way, is a very radical, extreme position, but that's still legal today in New York, even after the Roe ruling. So I know that Democrats want to talk about abortion all day long. Most people, when you talk to swing voters across the country, are angry about inflation, angry about gas prices. They're still more than double what they were before Joe Biden took office, and Joe Biden continues to go after oil, natural gas. It's hurting our economy in Louisiana. It hurts our revenue sharing to restore Louisiana's coast, but it's affecting a lot of other people in other states as well. And I think those are the kind of things you're going to see voters come out to the polls on November 8th to ultimately elect a lot more Republicans in the House.
But right now we see a country so divided, and I mean, there are a lot of bills that have gotten bipartisan support that a lot of Republicans, including yourself, voted no for. The CHIPS Act, the PACT Act, the infrastructure bill, which brings a lot of money to Louisiana. A lot of Republicans, including you, voted no on all those.
Yeah, well, and let's start with the infrastructure bill. We had been working with the administration on a $400 billion infrastructure bill. And I'm talking just roads, bridges, ports, waterways. Would have been the largest infrastructure bill in the history of America. Biden said, we don't want to work with you because it's got to be over $1 trillion. So they passed a $1.2 trillion bill, most of which had nothing to do with roads and bridges. Biden put a requirement in place that you can only use union workers and prevailing wage, which is not only going to jack up the cost, but it's going to make a lot of those projects unable to do. There's no permitting reforms. You will not see a lot of roads and bridges built from that bill. Why not go with a $400 billion very bipartisan package as opposed to $1.2 trillion for a whole lot of social programs that aren't going to help anybody drive on roads?
However, a lot of Republicans who voted against the bill went back to their districts and said, hey, we're bringing some money in with this infrastructure bill.
Look, there are a lot of projects that we were working on prior to that bill. I mean, I had gotten money before the infrastructure project to do things like widen I-12 up in St. Tammany Parish. That work's going on right now. That wasn't part of the infrastructure bill. I had also gotten money to do things like the Morganza to the Gulf Flood Protection Project. We had gotten money prior to the infrastructure bill. It may get other funding from other sources, but that's something we had gotten done prior to that bill passing.
This is supposed to fix bridges, things like that a lot of them
in
Louisiana
but most
are
of that
in bad
bill
shape.
isn't going to go to fixing roads and bridges, and all of its deficit spending. I mean, you think inflation is bad now, which it is. Interest rates are through the roof. Add another $1.2 trillion to the debt. At some point, somebody's got to pay for this, Eric. Shouldn't we try to pay for what we do? If we're going to spend $400 billion or $1.2 trillion, shouldn't it be paid for? None of that bill was paid for.
Right.
Our kids are going to have to pay for it.
All right, so let's go to the CHIPS bill, which would bring jobs to America, make chips or have chips made here in this country. How could that be bad?
Again, $250 billion added to the debt is the problem. There were a lot of these companies, whether it's Intel, you can go down the line, a lot of the big projects you're hearing about, many of them were announced publicly prior to that bill even getting filed, meaning those companies were going to build those chip plants in America before they got taxpayer funding. Now look, if you can get the government of the United States and the taxpayers of this country to build your project, you'd take the money, but you were going to do it on your own anyway. And now the taxpayer is going to fund it. Not with money that's around, it's all borrowed money. It's all money that ultimately our kids are going to have to pay.
A number of Republicans thought it was a good idea and did vote
We
for
all
that.
think it's a good idea to build more chips in America, borrowing $250 billion from our kids and grandkids to do what the private sector was already going to do anyway doesn't sound like a good deal for the taxpayer of the country. That's something that we obviously had a big debate over. Ultimately, we need to bring back not only chip manufacturing, we need to open up rare earth minerals. We don't, you talk about all these electric cars, if we're going to build more of them, where are we going to get the lithium, the things that you need to build the batteries for electric cars? We're getting all that from China and other countries right now. A lot of the ability to mine that, we have it here in the United States. We just can't get permits to mine it.
Well, and a lot of times you're Republicans who were against deficit spending, but then when President Trump was in office and that tax bill passed, that was deficit spending.
Actually, it wasn't. Go look at the record on the tax bill. When we cut taxes, the federal treasury the next year took in more money than it's ever taken in before.
Well, the economy was rolling then.
Well, the economy started rolling. We created jobs by cutting taxes, so more people paid taxes. What increased the deficit was Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Those programs are on their own budget. They're increasing dramatically. We've got to save those programs from bankruptcy because right now they're headed to bankruptcy. They just added more people to Medicaid's rolls. They just cut $250 billion out of Medicare. They cut drug pricing, drug payments in Medicare, $250 billion in the bill that President Biden just signed, the tax hike bill.
But the design of that bill, the tax bill, was to get corporations, lower the tax for corporations, and they'd put it back in their companies and their employees. But most corporations went ahead and just bought their stock back.
Most corporations hired more people. Again, we had virtual zero unemployment. Millions of new jobs came back to America, and because of that, millions more people were paying taxes into the system. That's why the federal treasury's amount of money that came in increased, because people were working again. Today, the government's paying people not to work. Every employer you talk to can't find workers because the government's paying them not to work. That's a problem.
Yeah. Well, they're not still paying not to work.
Well, and they increased welfare programs. Food stamps right now, the percentage of increase in food stamp spending has gone through the roof, and the work requirements on things like food stamps and other welfare programs went away. They got rid of the work requirements during the pandemic. Well, guess what? Now you got every company is trying to find workers. Your local restaurant's got half the tables empty and you're waiting an hour to get a table going. Why is that a problem? Because they can't get workers, and the government's still paying people not to work through all of those welfare programs.
And you think that's the reason why there's a work shortage?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. You've seen millions of people just stop working. Well, how are they putting food on the table? Because they're getting more benefits from the federal government not to work.
And the third act that I said you voted against was the PACT Act. That was to help veterans who had been injured by those burn pits over in Iraq and Afghanistan. Why would that be a no vote?
We had two different votes on that bill. There was one vote to make sure you take care of our veterans, and then Pelosi snuck in a $30 billion increase in spending on things that had nothing to do with veterans who had burn pit problems. So we forced a vote to say, let's take care of our veterans, but don't use the good name of our veterans to go and add $30 billion of deficit spending on things that have nothing to do with burn pit problems. And they rejected that. So we voted to take care of the veterans without the $30 billion in non-veteran related payments. I think that's what disgusts people about Washington, is they're using the name of our veterans to go add $30 billion of debt to spend on unrelated things. And they're talking about it as if it was only about the veterans. I think a lot of veterans are offended by the fact that their name was used to go and add $30 billion in non-related spending. Let's take care of our veterans. Don't bulk up the federal government spending and add to inflation using their good name.
So you heard from veterans who were against that?
Who were against using their name to add $30 billion on things not related to them. Take care of the veterans. Don't use their name to go and do other things that have nothing to do with them.
And right now, you've been fairly vocal about the search of Mar-a-Lago, President Trump's home in Florida, and the vitriol that's come over this, and the threats against police officers, the FBI. Republicans have been known to be so against the calls for defunding police, but now there's calls from your party to defund the FBI.
Well, it's not coming from me, and I've denounced threats to anybody, any law enforcement official. Look, right now you've still got people threatening and going after Supreme Court justices against federal law, and the Justice Department isn't even pursuing that still to this day. So, look, does anybody really think if his last name was Smith or Clinton, would they have raided the president's home? Of course not.
Well, if Smith or Clinton had classified documents, top secret documents.
Clinton did, by the way, and they exonerated her. They didn't even go after her. She had it on a server, and she wasn't even the president of the United States.
It wasn't the highest classified document that...
But every president who's left office has taken documents with him, including classified documents.
Permission.
But and President Trump was working with federal authorities. In fact, the archives had asked him to put some of that information behind lock and key, and he did it.
But
they still raided his house.
There are reports that in June, his lawyer said that they had everything. And then the raid came and they found out there were 27 boxes of stuff.
Well, but again, presidents have the ability to declassify things as well. That's their constitutional right.
But legally,
whether you agree with it or not, it's a constitutional
I understand
right.
That, but legally, that still didn't. I mean, it's still against the law to have some of those things.
But it's not against the law to have them the right way. And again, President Trump had been negotiating and cooperating with National Archives on the questions they did have. The real issue at bay here is, if this was anybody else, would they have done the exact same thing? It had never been done before in the history of our country. And the reason you're telling me these examples is because you've heard selective leaks. Some of this is leaks by the Justice Department. What President Trump has said is, just release the whole document. The document you used as the basis to raid the House, release it to the public.
News organizations
and Justice
are
is
asking
fighting
for just that.
And the Justice Department is fighting it, yet they're leaking selective things to the New York Times and the Washington Post.
Leaking?
Because it's being cited that they got this information from an unidentified source inside the Justice Department. For God's sake, I mean, be fair about this. If you think it's okay to let it out to the public, let it all out. Don't just let some of it out to your selected news organizations that you think will hurt one person. Well, your job should be to be administering justice fairly and equally.
Well, so let's say something comes out if they do release the full affidavit, and there are things that are illegal. Is there anything that President Trump could have done that would turn you and other Republicans and say, wait a minute, that wasn't right?
Well, obviously, yes. But again, we've seen allegation after allegation that's never been backed up. And this has been going on for over 4 years against this president by some of the very same people. And so what we're saying is just treat him fairly. Every other president, Barack Obama left office with millions of files, some of them classified, some of them not. Nobody questioned it. I surely didn't question that, because there's a process you go by. Every president's done it. It just so happens that the Justice Department raids this president's home because they don't like him.
However,
and again, if you don't like President Trump, that's one thing.
I get
but
it.
No, and I mean, this is for people in general. There's some people who say, well, I wouldn't want it to happen to anybody else, but because it's Trump, they'll look the other way. We shouldn't be looking the other way. Everybody should be treated fairly and equally. It's not been the case here.
Well, and there was a lot of Republicans talking about, and President Trump said that President Obama left with 33 million pages. The National Archives did debunk that and said whatever he had with our permission, and he gave
but
back.
They did say he had all of that information.
Yes.
And again, it's his prerogative as president to have that. Now, President Obama said he was going to put it all online. It's still not online, but he had the right to do it, just like President Trump had the right to take papers with him. And if there's an issue with classified documents, you work with the agency for how to preserve that. And Trump was doing that as well. And there's documents of that.
One last question. If the affidavit does show that in June, the lawyers for the former president said, we have turned over everything, and then you're going to have that raid, and then a lot of things turn up. Was somebody lying?
What I'm concerned about is what is in that document that justifies the unprecedented action of raiding a former president's home when they knew he wasn't even there. Look, Alan Dershowitz, who nobody would accuse of being conservative, said it should have never happened, but even if they had documents they wanted to get, there was 10 other ways to go get it, not raiding his home. And there's a process to go through. They didn't even try that. They just raided his home. When he was in New York, they went to his Florida home. They knew he was in New York, by the way.
Well, I understand that, but if his lawyers said that everything has been turned over and it was not, somebody's not telling the truth.
Well, no, his lawyers were saying that they've been working for months with the National Archives. That's what they've said, and there's documents and proof that they were going back and forth over a negotiation. Again, every president has had that negotiation, and so they were doing it. If they weren't complying, there's one way to handle it. That's not what happened here.